All right, I really appreciate you all coming tonight. I've met most of you either online, so it's really nice to meet you in person for the first time. I'm going to talk tonight a lot about where my ideas come from and a lot about write what you know. And so I'll give you sort of my history and some of the things I've experienced, and you can see how I fictionalized what I know into the different stories. So let me go ahead and start. And this is the most recent thing I've written. It's a revision of the original version. There were a lot of people interested in the original version. We couldn't recapture the rights as far as doing it identically, and I didn't see any reason to write the same thing. So this is a bit different. It's more of a thriller romantic and not quite so much horrific. And I will talk about some of the changes I made in this a little bit later. Okay, so most of you are here because you've read Dawn of the Vampire. This is about the 30th anniversary of when it came out. That makes me feel kind of old, but it's been 30 years, and I'm going to talk more about the end, about where the ideas came from and the stories, and I quite often get questions, what did you make up and what is real, sort of what was based on some real stories. So I'm here obviously because of my mom and dad, and they were big supporters of my books, even though they thought it was kind of questionable at the beginning because it doesn't exactly fit my college degree or what I went to college for or the jobs I did afterwards. The reason I ended up in Bristol in the first place is because my dad got a job here with a telephone company. Now, way back when, I'm originally from Indiana, and my father was a state assemblyman or a state politician, as the case may be. And he was, as you can tell, very active in the Republican Party and even ran for Congress as well as governor of the state of Indiana. And my mom got a little bit tired of it, so somewhere along the line, he decided to change jobs and change careers, and we moved to Kansas City. These are photos of my mom. And while we were in Kansas City, we picked up playing tennis. And I consider one of the greatest accomplishments I've ever had is I taught my mom to play tennis. And when she came to Bristol, she made all sorts of wonderful friends that liked to play tennis. And I ended up doing a lot of teaching as well while I was here of rackets and tennis balls. So my mom is a huge part of why I'm a reader. And back in first grade, I wasn't learning to read. So my mom really got upset with the teacher because I wasn't learning to read, who claimed that she had too many problem kids to be able to give me enough time. So my mom was the secretary at one of the public schools, secretary of a principal. So she made me leave the school I was attending to drive across town to attend first grade with a bunch of people I didn't know. And the deal was, if you learn to read, you can go back to the school you can walk to in about 20 minutes where all your friends are. So that was the deal was made. If I could learn to read and prove I could read, then I could go back to my school instead of going to my mom's school. Because who wants to go to your mom's school? You know, it even gets worse in the later years. I like to bring up Dr. Seuss because at the time we were doing a bunch of the Dick and Jane books were what we were having to read at that particular time. So I became interested in Dr. Seuss, and my mom didn't like Dr. Seuss because it's made up things and made up places about made up creatures. And I find it kind of ironic that I write stories about made up things and not made up places, but made up creatures. So I wasn't an early book reader, but I was an early comic book reader. I know I have had some comic book fans that are also fans. Originally, we traveled around in summers for about a month in the Winnebago, and one way to keep me out of trouble was to read. And they tried to tell me that there were, you couldn't find comics back in Indiana. You could just find them out west when we were traveling. But I got hooked, and so I did a lot of reading and a lot of collecting, and many of my ideas sort of come from that basis of almost anything's possible in the fictional world. Because typically, I've seen it a long time ago in comics before it shows up in movies or something on a streaming series. There is things done different ways, but comics, when they were producing something new every month, had to come up with some crazy idea. Now, Friday nights were one of my favorite nights because it was Nightmare Theater. And it was Nightmare Theater with Sammy Terry. and watched a lot of old films that even in the 1960s would have been considered old at the time. Dracula from '31 and Creature of the Black Lagoon were two of my favorites. Saturday night was science fiction theater, and so I went from watching scary stuff on Friday nights to space age fantasy on Saturday nights. One of the movies that made a big impact on me was Forbidden Planet. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the old movie Forbidden Planet, but anyway, the monsters in the story, the spoiler is here, is the people themselves that create monsters out of their own imagination, and the story is sort of don't let your imagination get too powerful or run away from you. Some of my other influences, many of you were probably familiar with Dark Shadows. Now, one of the reasons I enjoyed going to the local elementary school is because I could actually run home and beat the bus. You know, people talked about walking a mile or so to school. Well, I could get home faster if I ran. And if I ran, I could get home in time to see the opening credits of Dark Shadows. If I took the bus, I missed about the first half of it. So that kind of helped keep me in shape. I think part of Dawn of the Vampire was vaguely inspired by the old Night Stalker series, where we had an investigative reporter looking into creepy things with Darren McGavin. Okay, I'd mentioned that I grew up in Indianapolis. My father was a politician, and what ended up happening is after he decided to leave the political world, he'd been involved in public utilities and the telephone company. And so he worked for United Telephone Systems out of Kansas City, and he was their rate case lawyer. And he did a good enough job that he sort of worked himself out of a job, so they relocated him here as the company president. And as you can see, this is him playing tennis. And they created quite a group of tennis players while they were here. And I know this was my mom and dad's favorite place to live for just the people that were here. There were wonderful people, and they made the best friends ever, and I made some of my best friends ever as well. Well, when I got here, I got to go out on South Holston Lake for the first time. There aren't that many nice lakes in Indiana or in Kansas, in the Kansas City area. So I was fairly amazed, but I didn't get out on the water very much. But I did go from my early days of being behind a pontoon boat and barely able to get up to the days where I know nobody's ever done anything silly while they were out on the lake. So we got good enough and bored enough that we were able to try a variety of things at the time. And a lot of my setting comes from the lake and our time spent out there. So before I wrote Dawn of the Vampire, I've been living in Texas. I went to North Texas State and got my master's degree in industrial relations and personnel. I worked in the corporate world for about 5 years. I worked for a telecommunications company, and then I worked for a business that made storefronts and curtain walls for high-rise skyscrapers. And I got my first access to a computer. And I started working part-time when I was at home, working on my computer as a way to sort of escape the drudgery of work. So what I did is, after we sort of sold the idea on the first book, I decided that I'd had enough of the corporate world and I was going to escape to some place where I could write more often. And so I moved to Lake Tahoe, which is out in Nevada and in California, and is actually one of the inspirations for the setting in my books. So I moved to Tahoe, and my girlfriend from Texas followed me out, and she's in back, and she's my wife now. So Kat followed me out from Texas, and we were married in '92. And Dawn of the Vampire had been published by that time. But one of the interesting things that happened, and one of the things I did while I worked out there, I also ski patrolled. So some of my ideas, at least medically speaking, come from when I was an EMT, and some of the accidents and some of the stories I've heard from people over the years. So I ski patrolled from 1995 to 2010, and enjoyed being out on the mountains. And did a lot of riding as well there because it was a family resort. And fortunately, people didn't hurt themselves as often as they did at the big international resorts. So my second book, after Dawn of the Vampire came out, my editor had left. He went on to become an environmental lawyer. So I was one of the last books that he produced, which means I was an abandoned author, which is not something that's particularly good in the industry because, as he says, I'm your walking legs around, and I'm sort of the person that talks up your books and would be willing to have something else published. So when he went to law school, he was replaced by a guy by the name of Mike Sicilione, whose ideas of horror novels were Children in Jeopardy and Small Towns in Trouble, were the books he liked to produce. And what I found out at the time is that editors all have their own report card. So it's much easier and beneficial for them to take an author who's already successful and have them sell more books than start with somebody new. So when you're getting into the business, you're sort of low on the totem pole. So Mike didn't like my books because he thought I wrote too much like Dean Koontz, and he didn't like Dean Koontz. He was more of a Stephen King kind of guy. So I didn't get any interest as far as doing a second Dawn of the Vampire story because this editor didn't like the first one to start with. So fortunately, I wrote this one, and by the time I was ready to send it off, Pinnacle had gotten tired of their editor as well and moved him on and brought in another gal, and she had enjoyed Dawn of the Vampire and enjoyed this book as well. And we were going to do a horrific story about a California haunted resort. And then the horror market sort of crashed. And they went from being willing to publish a couple books a month to maybe one book a month. And it was going to be about 3 or 4 years before mine would fit in the slot to come out and be published. And that was California Ghosting. I think some of you have read California Ghosting. It takes place in Point Reyes area, just north of the San Francisco Bay. It's someplace I've visited several times. It was partly inspired by The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, if you remember that old black and white TV show way back when, where they had a friendly haunted spirit around the house. Also from my trips to Disney and Disney's haunted house. They're always willing to have one more spirit. I also worked in a nice resort across from the Heavenly Ski Resort that was a timeshare resort. And some interesting salesmen also worked there. So that all sort of mixes into this idea of this haunted resort that people go to have ghostly encounters. And that's what it's known for. And then, of course, there's a murder there, and something goes wrong, and it sort of changes the ambiance. And the main characters, one of them who inherits the resort, comes to due diligence and find out, okay, who murdered my uncle and why. So I'd gone from working with Pinnacle till we decided to start our own publishing company. And so one of the first things I worked on, even before Dawn of the Vampire, when I went to visit Kat in Texas, I had some extra time, but I didn't have my manuscript with me. So I started working on a new story about a bicycle that time traveled. And when I'd moved to Texas, I was really missing my friends from Vanderbilt University and other places that I'd been in back in Bristol as well. And I thought, wouldn't it really be nice to be able to get on a bicycle and go back in time or travel really far and visit my friends? And that was sort of the basis of that story. And then the first one was popular enough, it's written more for young adults, that I deal with the bully in the story and his history and how the history of our lives really affect our present. Wedged in between those books was one called The Vampire Hunters. If you remember the cover of The Vampire's Kiss when I put it up, the original manuscript, surprise, had too many characters in it. And it had a bunch of kid characters that were teens that sort of had their own story going on. So when my editor said, you need to cut a bunch of the characters, I completely removed this part of the storyline and put it in another book. Now, the first thing I ever worked on was called An Amok Fantasy, and I like to write fantasy, and it's called Wizard Sword. And the original idea came from a game we played that I'll talk a little bit more, a role-playing game called Dungeons and Dragons. And there's a bunch of different ways to die while playing the game. So my inspiration was, how many different ways can you die in a fantasy world? So that was sort of my basics. An Amok Fantasy is one that gets out of control and tries to kill him. Then I moved on to Gambling Vampires. My sweetheart, when she moved out, worked for Caesars as a gaming dealer. And so we had a variety of interesting experiences in dealing in the gaming market. And I used to tell people, you know, there's no clocks, There's no windows. They don't like to let the sunlight in. It sort of sounds like casinos could be run by vampires. And people would go, that's not fictional. I've worked there. So that led me to working on this story. It's set both in the Lake Tahoe area, which has casinos as well, and vampires. And I thought, well, you know, if there were a bunch of gambling vampires, how would they choose whoever is the head person to run their guild? And I would assume they'd have a large gambling tournament, and the person that was the luckiest and the winner would end up being the person that would run the guild. All right, I have a son who's not this young now, but at the time when I was writing was really cute and really little, and thought because he was really cute and really little, you should do everything. So he actually had some very magical powers of being able to manifest things or convince other people to do things without ever mentioning anything, without sort of like these psychic powers. So my son Bryn and my time in Tahoe, you can see this is Tahoe and Emerald Bay. Emerald Bay is the elongated one, and Cascade Lake is the round one. And this is shot from the top of Talac, where Kat and I were married back in '92, where we hiked 5 miles in and 3,500 feet up. And the minister said she'd never do it again, but without being helicoptered. So one time was good. So that led to some fantasy books at the time. Harry Potter was really, really popular. In fact, it's still fairly popular, but was going wild. And my thought was, if wizards have familiars and animals that are assistants, where do they get trained? Do they have a pet academy or a school that they go to? So I set it in Lake Tahoe. If I haven't mentioned it, I had 2 sisters when I was growing up. They were both evil older sisters. And if looks could kill, Indiana would be more than decimated at this particular time. So I took one of my sisters and used that particular character as my hot-headed, temperamental character who has to learn a lot about controlling your temper. One of my more interesting experiences after giving a presentation, they were going to use the room afterwards for anger management. It was shortly after I released it. I thought the timing was really good. And I used to go visit my sister's school in North Carolina. She's a librarian. So I really enjoyed telling him that, yes, the angry character is inspired by my sister. And yes, this mellow librarian you know now was really kind of vicious when she was a teenager. We traveled a lot in the summer, especially when my son was sort of from 9 to 16 or 17. And we visited lots of national parks. And Goblin Valley is one of my favorite parks. It's a state park in Utah. And between Sedona, Arizona and Arches, I decided to write a Native American-based story with a bunch of Native American legends and monsters that are based in national parks. And that pretty much came from all our unusual travels. And originally, back even before I was working on Dawn of the Vampire, I was basically working on a story I'd call Devil Bear, which is about a sort of spirit bear that gets out of control. It was inspired by a book I read when I was a kid in Indiana classics called The Bears of Blue River. And in one of them, they had a fire bear that was giving the hunters difficulty. So all that mixed up into this particular story. All right, so brings me back to here. For the original version. So fortunately, when I was water skiing, I got to meet a lot of good guys. And if you recall, I talked about my parents playing tennis. And my mom was playing tennis with one of the locals. And she said the guys are one of the mom's kids are staying up late at night, rolling dice and killing monsters. And I said, well, it sounds like they're playing Dungeons and Dragons. And she said, well, I'll ask next time I go. And she knew I'd played at college. And she says, do you want an invite? And I thought, well, sure, why not? So I was fortunate enough that I got to meet a bunch of different guys. And we did a lot of water skiing our second summer together, because none of us had access to a boat our first summer. And we were always careful on the lake, despite some of our interesting stories. And the only person that ever got hurt was our doctor, or eventually our doctor, getting tangled up with the ski, not anything we did in particular. So these are my blood brothers, and most of them are the ones that were in the book. So we take their stories and I fictionalized it. And Denny Rensell, during my senior year or a little bit later, was going to get married, and his best man was an editor for a publishing company called Pinnacle. And I'd been working on a story called Wizard Sword, and while we were together at the bachelor party and all the wedding festivities, I finally said, hey, I have a story. Would you be interested in reading it? I described it to him. He said, sure, I'll read it. He read it. He was in the process of changing companies. He said, the company I moved to doesn't write fantasy. So he gave me a list of different stories or different genres that they do. And I said, sure, I can do a horror story. I said, I'd always wanted to do a vampire story. And I've thought about that a lot, and I've wondered why I've always wanted to do a vampire story. And I know I mentioned this to Sandy the other day. When I was a kid, I used to have nightmares, probably from watching Dark Shadows and Nightmare Theater and that kind of stuff. And my mom was really sympathetic, and she said something like, well, you know that's happened when you watch that kind of stuff. If you quit watching that type of stuff, you wouldn't have nightmares. So that wasn't going to work for me. And one of my particularly bad nightmares was vampires chasing me all the way into a church. And it was a reoccurring nightmare I had frequently until I finally got tired of it. You know, even the type where you wake up and you go back to sleep and you're still stuck in the dream, and you wake up and you go back to sleep and you're still in this stupid dream. Well, that was happening quite a bit. So I turned myself into a vampire slayer in my dreams and took care of the vampires. And I'm wondering sometimes if that's where some of the idea for the story came from. So these are my best buds. Jambo's on the left. That's me next to him. We have some interlopers that weren't in the book that show up every now and then because we were playing Ultimate Frisbee that day. Denny Rensell is the one in gray shorts. And as I mentioned, Denny's the one that got married, and I got to meet the editor. And after the wedding, we had one of our reunions, but instead of being in Bristol, it was in Texas when I was living at a lake house. And the editor had said, you know, I really like your writing, so let's come up with an idea. So I had mentioned that I really liked the idea of South Holston Lake for a setting. He really liked the idea of me abusing some of my best friends in print because he knew most of them. He said, have a good time with them. I said, that way I'll be able to see him. And what I discovered in the publishing field is that editors like to publish what they like to read. So if you can entertain the editor, they're not particularly looking for what they think will sell as much as if they think they'll enjoy it, it'll end up selling. And it'll be something they feel comfortable pushing. So between the idea that Dave Hirschfeld, who was the editor, had been out on the lake and had been here with the Denny character, and that he liked the idea of me having fun with the characters, and I was a scuba diver at the time, had done a bunch of recreational diving. And one of my disappointments back from the Creature of the Black Lagoon is I was going, why don't you guys ever look under the boat? The trouble's in the water. You guys never look in the water. You're looking everywhere else, but you never look in the water. So between being a diver and thinking back to Creature of the Black Lagoon, I wanted my characters to be able to go into the water. And so we're brainstorming. Dave Hirschfeld, the character Knives, and I are pretty much the ones that are talking about it on the shore in Texas. And I was wondering what's a good idea for a reason to come up with diving. So this is where a really smart person in the group says, well, you know there's a cemetery underwater where we've been water skiing. And of course, I think everybody goes, huh? There is? We've been doing it all this time? In fact, one of my friends recently in the book thought I'd made that up, and that the idea of the mine that they go into, that the vampire lair was real. And I said, nope, it's backwards. The mine is just an area that I figured would be appropriate, and there really were cities underneath the water. He says, I had it completely backwards. So that would be the guy who's the second from the left, and that would be the spider character, the one that says, I am smiling, this is my happy face. So we got together, and Steve had given us the idea of the cemetery underwater. And so as I got finding out a little bit more about the Bristol area and the South Holston River Fork, that's when I found out a little bit more about the resorts. that were there, as well as trains that used to run along through there. And when I talked to people about it, I would hear some interesting stories that happened during the dam days. And they were usually secondhand stories that my father told me that when they worked on the dam, that somebody fell into the concrete, was never removed, or people wandered into the woods and were never seen again. So that gave me some idea and some fodder for the story. I think it's interesting that the area is known for ghosts and witches, but I use werewolves and vampires in my story. I guess that's because I was more familiar with that when I was doing it. So here's the Denny character, and here's my editor. Many, many years later, I chose this one over the one where he's sunning and has his sunglasses on. You can actually see what he was looking like. But it was really nice to be able to get together and to brainstorm. So he was interested in the story because of all the different components, both the characters, the setting. And one of the things he wanted us to start with was floating bodies. He said any good murder mystery around the body of water starts with floaters. And our buddy, the Tom Marauder character, had a tendency to have unusual accidents when he was out water skiing. If something weird happened while somebody was out in the water, it was this particular character. Whether the rope broke or the inner tube broke or he struck something, it always seemed to be sort of the same character. So that's who ends up striking the coffin in the story, because it just seemed really appropriate for him to be the one. Oops, go back. Oh, we've gone laser. There we go. Here we go. Hit the wrong button. So I had sent Dave an outline, and as well as half the manuscript, which is sort of what they required. Sometimes they required the entire manuscript. And after he'd picked it up, he told me that the cover was inspired by Dead Calm, which I wasn't familiar with and had to look up, which ultimately ended up being this for the cover. Now, one of the interesting aspects of this story is, I told you I was living at Lake Tahoe at this time, and this looks very much like Lake Tahoe, especially the snowy mountains, and the one in the back looks like Mount Talac, where we got married, that has the snow cross on it. So that was all sort of serendipitous, as the case may be. So Dave gave me some suggestions after he read the outline, and he only liked about half of my outline. So what I did is, when we talked, I just jotted down a bunch of notes, and I never did the rest of the outline, and I just did my writing from the notes that I took. Because remember, I told you, we're just trying to make the editor happy. Because it's kind of like if you make mama happy, the whole family's happy. It's the same way with the editors. If you make that particular editor happy, then you've got a better chance with your book being successful. Oh, here we go again. So the book came out in January of '91, and I really didn't hear much about it when it came out. Didn't hear much from people in Bristol. I had called the local bookstore, and they didn't do book signings here. The B. Daltons didn't do book signings, so they weren't interested in doing a book signing. I was offered to do a parade. I probably should have come back and done one of the parades. That was an offering I got, but I wasn't really sure that somebody who's sick vampires on the town really should be leading a parade. I wasn't sure that that was, the best of choice. I said, "Have you read the book?" He's like, "No, I haven't. I've heard about it." And I said, "Okay." I just said, it is kind of the Bible Belt. I'm not sure if everybody would appreciate that, as the case may be. So this is my Tom Marauder character, and I had nothing to do with what went on the cover, or what goes on the back cover, or what the artwork was, or even the title. All that was chosen by the publisher. My original title was Darkness Walks in the Light, and he said, "That's way too poetic." He says, "The powers that be wanted to scream vampire. It's got to say vampire in it so that they know that there's vampires in the story." So vampires ended up being in the story. Diving ended up being in the story, partly from my experiences in diving in Hawaii, where the water is much clearer. I was able to do some coral diving. I was able to do some diving into some unusual rock formations, and that, I'm sure, is part of the inspiration of putting a haunted house on the bottom of the lake with interesting places to swim inside and unusual creatures. Years later, I saw those particular diving areas on an episode of Magnum P.I. And I was like, I've been there. I've been in the underwater cathedral. So it wasn't until later that my mom's good friend sent this to me, Sugar Green, that I had some idea, because I'd actually asked the paper if they wanted any information, and the paper didn't want, any information at the time either. They called me later because I found it interesting in here that, reportedly I'd lived summers, that I had lived in Bristol at some point, and they weren't sure if this was my real name and all that kind of stuff. And this was after I'd already sent them, information into the paper, sort of a press release. They were interested about a year later. I didn't realize until Kathy told me much later that probably most of the Dawn of the Vampires that were sold here in Bristol. She said she used to get calls from the buyer in New York wanting to know why this area kept buying so many books. They just couldn't understand why the book was so popular here. She says it takes place here, but New Yorkers. So after the success of this book, and you can see I wrote 10 books. I've written 10 books in between Dawn of the Vampire and now, and I kept seeing how expensive it was sometimes to try to pick up a Dawn of the Vampire, or how difficult it was to try to pick up one online. So I decided I would go through and see about revising the book, and so I had to see about getting the rights back. And you have to wait 16 years after the book is out of print to request your rights back. Now, we had a feeling it had been out of print a little earlier. They kept saying it was out of stock, and it was sort of perpetually, permanently out of stock after about 2001, I think. Might have been the last printing. It went through 7 or 8 printings. I think it sold about 82,000 copies or something, and I figure, 70,000 were sold here in Bristol. And I know Sandy ended up probably giving a whole bunch away. So I thought, well, if it was that popular, one of the things you can do is I can revive the series, and I'll do a different take on the story, and people will really be happy that there's another story and there's another take on it, or they'll really be upset that I changed the original. And so either way, I'll have some interest and some controversy, because there's always people that like the original James Bond or the first version of anything because it was the first time they saw it. So I went back and I reread this, and if you've been on the fan page, we've talked about some of the errors that showed up in Dawn of the Vampire, and that was partly because we sent off the manuscript, they edit it, they send it back to you, and including mailing time, you have a week to read it. So they've taken your manuscript, they've made changes, they've cut stuff out, and you have 5 days. I had about 5 days to take a look to read everything. And they said, yes, we don't want to give authors very long because we think they'll change their mind. And they'll say, well, I need to do this and I need to do that. And they're probably right about that as well. But that's part of the reason some of the things crept in. When we did the revised version, we changed King College Cemetery really to East Hill Cemetery, and we got some of the names more accurate. It was much easier to do research in 2017 than it was back in 1990. I had an interesting exchange with the TVA because I wasn't in Bristol at the time, and I was trying to get some information about the lake, and they didn't have the website and all that information set up so that you could just click and go to the TVA website. So I called up and got the number and wanted to ask some questions, and the guy was like, well, can't you just drive over here? We're in Knoxville, it can't be very far. And I'm like, well, I'm in Nevada. And I told him what I was doing, and I sort of promised that I would not make the TVA the bad guys, that the thrust of my story was not to make the Tennessee Valley Authority the bad guys. And after I told him that, I had a much more friendly person to deal with, because I sort of had a hostile response when I called up and kind of wanted information about the dam. Because they get, whether justifiably or not, blamed for a lot of things that happened. And he was obviously very sensitive about that. Doing research is a lot easier now. So in Revived, there's more history of the lake and more history of the town than there is in the original version. All right, click that off.
That was the last
one. Okay.
Bristol?
Withville, okay. I want to answer questions about what's real and what's not real. So when we were working on the story, there were places like Jacobs Creek and Summers Creek and a variety of places along the South Holston River, but I didn't think any of those sounded scary enough. So I wanted some place that had a little bit of an unusual name to it, but sounded like it would be from the region, because I have some real skeptical friends that are like, oh yeah, you came up with that name. So I took Withville and I rearranged the letters some and came up with Wraithville. And so that way when my friends came up with, oh, what kind of name was that? And they looked through the area and said, oh, okay, there's Withville. We can see how that would be associated with that. So there is no real town of Wraithville or Withville, as they sometimes like to talk about it. It was one I made up for the sort of like a vampire run town. And if I ever get to a fourth book, that's what I plan to deal with. I plan to deal with Wraithville and what happened back at that particular time. So we never encountered any vampires at the lake. We never did any scuba diving at the lake. We did a lot of other things on the surface, but we didn't do any diving for the lake. We never went water skiing at night, though we talked about it a lot. We really liked skiing at sunset, and we were like, wouldn't it be really neat to hook up, lights on the front and music on the back and big beams and be able to water ski? And the reason we didn't is because it was against the law, for one, and we were always concerned that we might hit something that was floating in the water that we couldn't see otherwise, which sounds like how the book starts, doesn't it? Somebody hit something in the water that they didn't see when they went around and checked it the first time, and that's what we were always concerned, that something would pop up from the bottom, and there would go your summer for water skiing the rest of the time, because we were always particularly careful because we wanted to be able to keep skiing and not have an accident happen or somebody get hurt and say, no more boating for you guys. We only almost sank it once. We'd come out late and we're in a hurry and forgot to put the plug in. And fortunately, we parked at Cliff Island because all those guys were hungry all the time. And they're like, we're too hungry to go water skiing. And we're sitting there eating and the boat's starting to fill up. We're like, did we put the plug in? Okay, where's the extra plug? That was about as close as we ever came to sinking it. But it's those type of events, even though there's small, minor things that happen that lead to the outrageous things that happen in the story. You think, well, what if I took this to more of an extreme where the boat did sink? So that's the way those type of stories go from, I guess, being blown out of proportion. If you came home and had to come up with some excuses. Probably a lot of you would like to know where I'm going next. How am I doing on time?
Good.
Got plenty of time on story, good. I've been working on something since I was last here in 2018. I had plenty of good ideas, and my original concept was what was in Von Dam's basement, because they dealt with a lot of the house and the upstairs, and he was an alchemist, and does he have anything weird in the basement going on? In the version of Revived, if you haven't read it, there's sort of a spoiler, but there's a scene where some of the characters are trapped in the basement or the stairwell to the basement. And when I was working on Revived, one of the things I enjoyed in writing the book were a lot of the diving scenes. And I thought there simply weren't enough diving scenes in the original Dawn of the Vampire, so I add, I think, 2 or 3 extra diving scenes in the Revived version. Now, for the new version that I'm working on, the new story, besides what's in the basement, the sequel, what's in the basement, I'm just calling it Dawn of the Vampire 2 at this point, though we're leaning toward calling it Ruins of the Vampire, partly because the haunted house is in ruins, partly because a lot of the problems come from it, and maybe things that wash up on shore. I also thought during the time that I had the idea that reality TV had become quite big, and I'm not a reality TV person, but one of my friends likes to watch a show called Adventures Unknown or Beyond the Unknown or something like that, and he's always exploring legends in different places. So I thought, what if I had a group of mythbusters of sorts that came to find out about what happened underneath the lake? and whether what they heard was true or not. So I come up with a whole female crew this time of what I call myth huntresses who have their own show that are going to explore the legend of what happens under the lake with the ruins, and to see if any of the rumors or the weird stories that they are hearing are true. So that was my basis for coming up with the next story, what I'm going to call Ruins of the Vampire. It kind of got out of control. Partly I have you folks to blame, because I know that part of the interest was in the first book was that I used real characters as some of my inspiration. One of the things I forgot to mention is my editor was concerned enough that we had all the characters write releases so that I could use them, because he said, you know, they're not as fictional as some people are. And he says, you never know what people may say 30 years later if they make a movie out of it. He may have said, you know, I want rights to that. You didn't have my permission to do that. 30 years later, none of that has happened, but it was interesting that I had to have them all sign releases to get that done. So at least I think via the internet, when I've asked people to be characters, all the information is on the internet, and I kind of consider that a release. And as I told everybody, I said, if you've been dying to get into a book, here's your chance, because I need characters to kill off. So I know some people are interested, did my character survive or not? And as I told my mom, I said it was just much safer to say I'm just going to kill everybody, and if their character survives, they're feeling really relieved about the whole thing. So that was my basis for the story. Bessie's been reading it for me, and she knows it has gotten rather long, so there's a good chance it'll probably be released in 2 books, because it's much.
This one is better.
This one's better?
I think it's better than the other.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, as I'd mentioned to folks in line, my mom's been reading it and it's given her nightmares, and she doesn't like it, so. That's a good sign there. So I started work on it pretty much in January after we left here, which would have been January of 2019. When I was here last time, the people bombarded me with all sorts of good ideas. From some paranormal investigators that I met that I use in the story. People wanted to talk a lot about caves and different experiences they had in caves. And I use caves in the story, but I'm pretty sure I don't use them as they were thinking that I might use them. But I love the idea of them running underground and in different places. And you know, wouldn't that be a great place for a vampire to get around from one part of town to the other without ever having to come up into the daylight? So I think Chris Brown, and there were probably some other that mentioned some of the different caves in the area. So that's...
Bristol Caverns is still for sale.
Bristol Caverns is for sale. We've talked about that. And it makes an appearance. Yeah, I tried to use settings that people were familiar with. In fact, if folks on my fan page, I asked for places that I could kill people off. And I found it really interesting that Facebook was a great help, that any time that somebody mentioned a place, it gave me a map. It's here. And I wondered if they were really understanding what we were sort of recommending at the time, even though it was fictional. Where can we bump off people? So that's kind of my basis for the new story. When I asked for characters, I think if I'd asked for characters back in 1990 and 1991, I would have gotten more normal characters volunteered than I got for the current book. I mean, I had lots of people wanting to be vampires. Who knew so many night nurses or nurses wanted to be vampires? I didn't know that was the second life or the second job of a lot of nurses. I had numerous ones that, sure, I'll be a vampire and I'll work the night shift. Yeah, there we go. Have one there. Plenty of werewolves, people that loved being werewolves. The people I picked quite often went, oh yeah, that's perfect for my particular character. Then I had some that maybe wanted to be the crazy horse lady that patrolled town. Nobody in here would resemble that mark. I had characters that wanted to be witches as well, snake hunters, belly dancers, Just a wide variety of unusual folks that I didn't expect to show up in my story that are now showing up in my story. And I won't give away some of the even stranger ones that some of the folks came up with. But I wanted to add a lot of Bristol character because I'm actually writing this for you folks as fans. You know, if people outside of Bristol or outside of the area don't find it all that interesting because it's so much rooted to here, I'm writing it for the folks in this room and the ones on my fan page, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to include people that, you know, they look like you. They might be weirder than you are because you've just given me your altered ego who wanted to do these other strange things. But that's no different than my buddy Tom Marauder. When I asked my friends, I said, hey, I'm going to write a book and put you all in it. And it's going to be sort of a lot like the D&D games that we had. And one of the things I discovered, I was the DM, so I was sort of the computer or the game master, and I was everything that the characters weren't. So I was the world and the terrain and the monsters and the people you meet. So everything the computer would do is what I was doing. And that was sort of the inspiration for, hey, I think I can write a book off of this. So when I was talking to my friends and said, I'm going to put you in print, all of them were pretty good, and they pretty much were just don't embarrass me, make me look good, except for my buddy Tom Marauder, who said, I want to be the most interesting character in the book. I want to be immortal, and I want to sleep with multiple women. It's like, okay, I think I can work that out somehow. Can figure it out. So that's where some of his interesting character is. So I always warn people, if you volunteered to be in a book, you never know what might happen. Originally, he was sort of disappointed in his character because he said, you know, you only took one dimension of me. And I said, well, one of the things you do when you work on a story and you work on characters, you focus on their strengths and you focus on their weaknesses. And since you weren't the main character, I didn't have time to go through all the different gradations of who you might be and when you're a nice guy and when you're not so nice a guy. We just needed to come up with something that I could work as your strength and work as your weaknesses, and that's going to be true for all the characters. Now, typically when I come up with characters, they're from multiple people. Like they might look like this individual, but they might sound like this individual, and they might act like somebody else. And that way I sort of get an amalgamation of folks. But for these particular guys, I pretty much dissected their strengths and weaknesses. And one of the things that helped me, as I mentioned during the game sessions, they would play different characters. Some people actually played different characters. Some people played the same person every time they played a different character. So I could pull out sort of what their normal traits were and transfer them over into the book. So you can see a lot of what I've written about is what I know and what I've done and what other people have done and what I've heard about and what I can extrapolate to hopefully make things interesting. One of the things I'm trying to do in the story now is try to add more suspense. I also realize I'm going to need to add more spiders because everybody I've met seems to be paranoid about spiders. Anybody I've met on this trip is, including my mom. So I may need to add more spiders to the story. But it's been fun to meet the people that are going to be characters in the story, and because some of you I've just met through Facebook and chatting with you, and some of you filled out an application. So thank you for filling out the job application. I had a really good time with that. So it's made it easier for me to come up with even strange characters since you've sort of volunteered to be somebody different in the story, and I think it's neat. It has made things easier. What else can I tell you about the upcoming book? If things go well, it'll come out in March or April. I was hoping to have a cover from my cover artist, but he's kind of particular. Do you need it yet? Well, I'm just going to show it for, is it going to be printed yet? I have other things to do, so it's not quite done yet, so I'm not going to tell you what's on the cover. I'd rather show you. It would have a bigger impact. But it'll be something that's inspired by the original cover, since it'll be the sequel to it. It'll be both rooted in both the books, both the original and the revived. Something different happens to the Marauder character in Revived that happens in the first one. So that changes what continues on through the rest of the story. If things go really well, it would be like a March, September, because the book takes place around Halloween. So I'd really like to have it finished and out before Halloween comes around of next year, not this year. We could have tried to rush it. It probably would have been about 800 pages or something like that. So that's why we're going to cut it into maybe 2 400-page books. I had reached a point in the story when something big happened. I thought this would be a particularly good place to end it, but I have all sorts of things unresolved. You probably know where I'm talking about too. All sorts of things unresolved that I need to finish the story, and some of those were things that were unresolved in the original Dawn of the Vampire. What happened to the original detective Bill Glazier? We know he doesn't show back up, but we don't know exactly what happened to him. So I try to tie up a few of those loose ends. Some of those come from reviews I had, some of the bad reviews I had earlier about too many characters, characters seeming too much the same were some of the main complaints that I had for the story. So I tried to be a little more clear in the revision of it and not try to introduce quite so many people at once and maybe mention them ahead of time. Time for questions, because I want to make sure we have an opportunity. Yes, sir?
Movie rights.
Movie rights. You mean, do I own the movie rights? Yes.
Have you ever been offered?
I have never been offered anything movie rights wise. I'm almost hesitant to say anything. The big difference between now and 30 years ago, the book has an agent in Hollywood. And so that can be exciting because that means, sort of like I had an editor at the publishing, that I have somebody to promote my ideas and my work. But also nothing could happen as well, because I just have somebody interested in promoting the book who takes the approach of trying to assemble people that are interested and then selling it, as opposed to doing it the other way around, trying to sell it and then get people interested. Because this individual who's from Bristol, and I promised I wouldn't mention the individual's name because she doesn't want to be known as somebody who wasn't successful in getting it out there, but I've had people ask me all the time about movie rights or something along that line, and she was from here, read the book when it came out, said she'd never forgotten about it, never read anything about it, checked with her local horror movie guru that has watched every horror movie on any channel on every movie, and said no, there's never been anything about vampires in a lake. So we can all keep our fingers crossed. And she says if things move at miracle speed, 5 years would be fast. So
Or to become a movie.
to become a movie. So, 4.5 years from now, if things really went well, something could happen. And she thinks, based on the current environment, that if something like that happened, it would more likely to be a stream series, because she thinks it suits better for that. It's currently what's popular, and they're less expensive to do because of the advertising budget. So she just had all sorts of good reasons of why that would work better. But no, I haven't sold the movie rights, but I have the movie rights, and that was the nice thing about getting the book back, as well as I have control over it. Or
On location.
yeah, on location. Oh, well, like I said, the person that's interested is from here.
I understand.
So,
There's a dive shop down the road.
and as I used to tell her, people used to say, if you're from Bristol, you're not really going anywhere. And look, she's been in the movie business for 25 years. And
Hey, too much information.
yeah, so just a she. Yeah, just keep the names.
Now I know who it is.
But that's all we know, and I probably won't mention anything until we actually know something of significance, because I've followed other books I've been interested in, and they say, somebody bought the rights, it could happen anytime, and here we are 15 years later and nobody has still picked up the project. So I kind of like the idea of, I haven't worried about my friends saying, who can play me? I'd like so-and-so to play my character in the book. I said, you're really not going to have any choice. I won't have any choice either. From everything I've heard, you're pretty much the low person on the totem pole. You gave us the idea, but we're going to take the idea and do what we think would work with it in the Hollywood frame. So there's no telling what it might end up. One of the guys I knew that was very much in the publishing business had some movies done, and he said, you can be in there, and they'll be saying something, well, what if we make the main character a dog? I'm like, that doesn't sound like a real fun experience. He said, well, you can be in the room for the entire time, and they've never asked you a question about your creation. So I had talked about this with the agent, and she said, no, it won't be like that at all. So we'll just keep our fingers crossed. But I won't mention much about it until something actually happens, because I don't want to get people's hopes up. In fact, I haven't even mentioned it on the fan page for the same reason. I didn't want to get people's hopes up. Because, you know, even if good news, 5 years is a long time. I'll be into retirement and some other things, right?
Yeah.
Other questions?
If we're still alive, will you invite us to the premiere?
Oh, if we're still alive, you know what I'd really like to do if we ever get that far is when they did Pirates of the Caribbean, they did a big outdoor screen at Disney. So it seemed like we would need to do something out by the lake, you know, a big outdoor screen out by the lake. So well,
The first premiere at the Paramount.
or something like that. So just I'll keep that in mind somewhere, and who knows, maybe we can project that out.
Maybe you could use the drive-in.
And something good would happen. So, well, the drive-in may have other things happen in it. So, in the book, so we may or may not want to do it there. Other questions? I can't have covered everybody's information of what they want to know about either what's happening or what happened.
Ask you on the fan page.
I was going to say a lot of it I put on the fan page.
Where'd you go to school when you lived in Bristol?
I didn't. It's rather interesting. I was offered. What's that?
Vanderbilt.
Yeah, I went to school at Vanderbilt, but that was college. My dad moved here just before my senior year, and I said I'm not moving because they just moved me 3 years ago during 9th grade, and I was very involved in tennis and that sort of stuff. And I was like, can't I spend my senior year here? I really don't want to move. I did come to Bristol. It was nice, but you know, all my friends, and I didn't want to come here for 1 year and then head off. Now, one of the interesting things about that is I had a reputation before I ever got to town because I was known as the tennis player that didn't want to come to Bristol. And during one of my early trips here, I was in a car accident. And so I was known as the guy who didn't want to come to Bristol that had a car accident when he was here. And I would meet people around town that said, oh yeah, I've heard about you. You're not the jerk I heard you were. So I don't know what would have happened if I'd actually come and spent my senior. I would have gone to Tennessee High. We're on the Tennessee High. And there's friends I have from here that graduated at the time. My financial advisor still thinks I went to high school here my senior year, even though
What year was
I
that?
didn't. That would have been 78. Would have been the class of 78. And then since we moved here, I had visited Vanderbilt, and that's where I attended. Got my degree in economics and business management, and my minor in philosophy. And what I use mostly is my minor in philosophy in stories more than I use, you know, economics. I use business management too. But people used to meet me in Vanderbilt and say, you know, you're not the typical student that we have here. Like, isn't that a good thing? But yeah, I did not go to school here. I spent lots of summers here, my summer vacations, any other holidays, that kind of stuff. So, and didn't even get out on the lake in the early years. It took till my dad had a boat to get out on the lake. And after that, I discovered what lake time was. Kind of like island time. You're on your own time. When the sun sets, then the day's done. Other than that, the day just kind of goes on.
Yeah, we're proud of our lake.
Oh, it's a beautiful, best lake I've ever skied on, and I have friends that visited here that say the same thing, that it's just the most magnificent lake they've been on for glassiness. And we were out on Sunday, and it was the clearest day I can ever remember being out on the lake because the mountains did not look foggy. It would have been a bad day to be a vampire out at the lake that day. There was very little cloud cover, very little humidity, and it was very, very clear. Speaking about the sunlight, of course, in the original story, that was the argument between the vampires, which was, I think, one of the things that made it interesting to the editors, that there was a split between those that wanted to stay the same and those that wanted to be the superior breed and get rid of their greatest weakness. And that split between factions and the revenge is part of what I cover in Dawn of the Vampire 2 and Ruins of the Vampire. That was one of the things I got from people that reviewed it that wanted to know, you didn't tie it up neatly enough. There's still loose ends out there. I thought, okay, we're going to have some fun tying up loose ends. So instead of years later, it's going to be 2 months later. So instead of being in August of whenever the story happens, it's going to be moved over into October because I wanted to deal with Dylan's transformation into being a vampire. And recently I've read a book called Perceptions, and it sort of gave me a good idea of how to look through somebody else's eyes and perceive what their different world might look like. So I've tried to get a good idea of, you know, what being a vampire would be like in Bristol, and sort of trying to walk the borderline between still interacting with humans and still trying to keep your humanity and yet still being in this dark world as well, especially if you're missing the sunshine. Just think how tough it would be to be a vampire if you were really a sunshine lover like me and you had, like sad, you really miss the sun and the seasonal changes and they turn you into a vampire. No more sunshine. So I don't know if that would be part of the impetus to maybe be transformed into something else. So I could see how the arguments might go either way. So I think I should probably leave some time either for final questions or photos. I know some people wanted to do some photos, and if I need to sign anything else. Any last questions? Thank you, everybody. This is about twice or 3 times more than last time.